Today we're answering one question. Why did Cha Eun-woo run into serious trouble right at the beginning of 2026? Why then? Well, before we answer that, let's just open his birth chart. If he came to me for a consultation, I wouldn't begin with the Dashas. I almost never do. I'd start with the Ascendant. That's usually where the story begins. His Ascendant is Gemini, and every time I see Gemini rising, I find myself remembering the same old story. I've always liked it. Not because I think it literally happened, but because it explains something complicated in a very human way. The sun was the king of the zodiac. The moon was the queen. Each of them had only one throne. The sun ruled Leo. The moon ruled Cancer. Simple enough. Then one day Prince Mercury came along. Smart kid, quick mind, already making money. He went to his father first and asked for a place beside him. The king smiled and gave him Virgo. Then Mercury walked over to his mother and asked exactly the same question. She smiled too and gave him Gemini. Venus watched the whole thing and thought, well, if he can do that, why can't I? So she asked the king and received Libra. Then she asked the queen and received Taurus. Mars followed. Jupiter followed. Even old Saturn eventually made the trip. He arrived last, slow, tired, limping, according to the old story. But nobody turned him away. He received Capricorn and Aquarius, and that's how most planets ended up with two signs. Now, here's the part I've always found fascinating. Those two signs are not equal. At least, I've never treated them as equals when reading a chart. One sign does the heavy lifting. The other one simply supports it. That's how I've come to see it after looking at chart after chart. Keep that in the back of your mind, because now we're coming back to Gemini. In Jyotish, the 6th, the 8th and the 12th houses are called Dasthanas. Trouble houses, if you like. Debts, conflicts, losses. That's usually where life decides to test us. I've looked at a lot of charts over the years, and one thing kept catching my attention. Gemini is different. Every single time I went through the 12 ascendants, I ended up seeing the same pattern. Only Gemini is built this way. None of the stronger planetary signs fall into the Dasthanas. I don't know if that sounds impressive yet, but it should. Because whenever I see Gemini rising, I don't expect life to fall apart because of one bad period. If a real crisis shows up, I immediately start looking for several triggers working together. That's usually where the answer is hiding. Now let's go back to Cha Eun-woo, Gemini Ascendant, exactly what I expected. Year after year, his career keeps moving forward. More dramas, more success, bigger contracts, more recognition. Everything looks almost too smooth. Then January 2026 arrives. Cha Eun-woo once shared his birth time himself during an interview, so we can calculate his Vimshottari Dashas with reasonable confidence. And when I opened them, this is what I saw. Venus, Saturn, Moon. And the moment I saw that combination, it clicked. Not because one planet explained everything, but because all three of them were telling exactly the same story. At first glance, it's easy to think Venus is the whole story. Cha Eun-woo is exceptionally good-looking. Venus is exalted, and his career has been remarkable. So the obvious conclusion is, well, it must be Venus. I don't think so. At least, not in this chart. Every time I open this chart, my eyes go somewhere else first. And let me show you why. Venus is sitting almost right behind the Sun, only about 1 degree away. In Jyotish, that's combustion. Some astrologers even describe it by saying the planet becomes blind. I've always liked that expression because it tells you exactly what's happening. Venus is still there, but she isn't really leading anymore. The sun is. And the sun isn't just anywhere. It's sitting in the 10th house of career, exactly where it receives Digbala, directional strength. That's what immediately caught my attention the first time I studied this chart. So yes, Venus Mahadasha activates the 10th house. I completely agree with that. But every time I look at this combination, it feels less like Venus is carrying the career, and more like Venus quietly opens the curtain, while the sun walks onto the stage. Now let's see if the timing agrees with that idea, because I always trust the timeline more than a beautiful theory. Venus Mahadasha begins in 2011, when Cha Eun-woo is only 14 years old. To most people, that sounds incredibly young, but the entertainment industry plays by very different rules. Britney Spears was already performing at 11. Christina Aguilera began at 13. So 14 doesn't surprise me at all. What interests me is something else. The first years of Venus Mahadasha don't suddenly turn him into a superstar. His official debut with Astro only comes in 2016, when he's 19. Before that, everything looks exactly like what I'd expect. Years of preparation, training, auditions, small opportunities, slowly finding his place in the industry. Then, little by little, those opportunities begin to grow. The career becomes real. The public starts noticing him. And that's exactly the kind of progression I'd expect if Venus is activating the house, while the sun is providing the real driving force behind it. Now I'd like to test that idea one more time, because a good hypothesis should survive more than one test. The tax investigation becomes public during the Venus-Saturn period, specifically in the Moon sub-period, when emotional pressure and public anxiety tend to peak. Saturn immediately catches my attention because sitting in the 10th house, it often brings accountability. Institutions, government, audits, moments when success has to answer difficult questions. But here's what I find interesting. Before those heavier sub-periods arrived, the sun had already been active. And yet, no major public crisis appeared. Then the Saturn period comes in, and suddenly the pressure becomes visible to everyone. Later, the Mars sub-period begins. And I don't expect Mars to magically erase the problem. That's not how astrology works. But Mars in Leo is rarely passive. It usually wants to defend itself, protect its reputation, and answer criticism head-on. So the longer I stay with this chart, the more convinced I become that Venus isn't carrying the story by herself. She certainly gives beauty, charm, presence. That's obvious. But the engine behind the career, the planet carrying the real weight, looks much more like the sun. And that's exactly why the ascendant matters so much here. Because once you understand how this chart is built, the events of 2026 stop looking random. They begin to follow a pattern. And here's one more thought. If this reading of the chart is correct, then Cha Eun-woo's biggest career success may still be ahead of him. Why? Because Venus Mahadasha won't last forever. When it ends, the Sun Mahadasha begins. And if I've read this chart correctly, the Sun has been carrying much more weight than Venus all along. Venus may have opened the door, but the Sun built the career. If that's true, then the next Mahadasha won't weaken the story. It may actually take it to an even higher level. We'll find out soon enough. Charts are patient. Time is the final judge. Now, what else catches my eye in Cha Eun-woo's chart? Whenever I read a chart, I always begin by judging the strength of the ascendant. If the ascendant isn't strong, everything else becomes much harder to sustain. Here, the ruler of the ascendant is Mercury, and Mercury sits in the 11th house. That's usually a very promising placement. It tells me this soul came into this life with desires it genuinely has a chance to fulfill. But there's another side to it. Mercury is sitting in the sign of Mars. And Mars isn't exactly Mercury's favorite host. Success is certainly possible, but it rarely comes without frustration somewhere along the way. So naturally, my next question is, where is Mars? Because Mercury always tells only half of the story. Mars tells the other half. When I open the Bhava Chalit chart, things become much more interesting. Mars shifts into the 4th house, and possibly into Mercury's sign. If that's correct, the two planets exchange signs. In Jyotish, we call that Parivartana Yoga. I've always liked this yoga, because it behaves very much like real life. Imagine you're living in your enemy's house, while your enemy is living in yours. Neither of you can afford endless conflict. Sooner or later, you learn to cooperate. That's why Parivartana often softens the hostility between the two planets. They don't suddenly become friends, but they stop working against each other quite so aggressively. And that's another reason I never stop with the Rashi chart alone. Sometimes the Bhava Chalit chart completely changes the conversation. So, what did this chart teach us? I've come back to it a few times, and 3 things still stand out. First, never judge a planet by its sign alone. An exalted Venus may catch your eye, while the Sun quietly carries the whole story. Second, always begin with the ascendant. One small detail there can change everything that follows. And third, life rarely changes because of one planet. Real turning points happen when several factors begin speaking together. That's when I start paying attention. Maybe that's why I enjoy Jyotish so much. Every chart has a story. If you're patient enough, it will eventually tell you. Every chart has a story. This was Cha Eun-woo's. The next one may surprise us even more.